G'day and welcome to CTO Lifeline number 9. Today's topic, break the cycle, how to increase impact and make less of the same mistakes. And I'm co-host Daniel Walters, and with me is my fellow co-host, Noah Cantor. How are you doing, Noah?
Doing pretty well. It's been an exciting talk to look forward to. So I'm glad we're all here finally.
Excellent. And we are joined with not one but 2 guests. So we've got Dr. Bloom. How are you doing, Jabe?
Doing well. Thank you for having me, Daniel. Nice to see you, Noah.
And we've also got Ben Mosier. How are you doing, Ben?
Not too bad. Thank you both for having us.
Excellent. Now, I'm really excited to have Jabe and Ben on the show for multiple reasons. During my time as a CTO, and I'm sometimes feeling a bit stuck and I'm browsing Twitter because I can't think of anything else to do. And I stumble upon a tweet from Jabe, and all of a sudden what I'm seeing at work makes sense. And I start to see a pathway forward. So I know I've mentioned this before, but yeah, can't thank you enough. And it's similar with Ben. I was struggling with strategic procurement questions and started to go down or get involved in the Wardley mapping community. And there I find Ben, who communicates about, complex things in really simple, accessible ways. So yeah, anyway, thank you both. Really excited.
Thank you.
Excellent. Noah, we've got some housekeeping before we get into the topic.
Yeah, so as always, we will answer any questions we have as we go. So feel free to just drop them in the comments. And afterwards, we'll be hosting a recording on LinkedIn and YouTube for anyone who missed it or would like to refer back to it. So for anybody who would like to help us out, please follow the CTO Lifeline LinkedIn page and the CTO Lifeline YouTube channel, so you get notified about upcoming episodes and guests, and we get to obviously get in front of more people and help more CTOs.
Excellent. So today's topic, we were chatting about if the 4 of us got together, what might we talk about? And Ben put a few topics out there, and one was around the behaviors of a learning organization, and I gravitated to it really quickly. So Ben, do you want to share a little bit about your motivation and about the framing of that topic and why it was interesting for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that folks who may know me from the Wardley mapping world, and those of you who don't know me at all, might find interesting is that I started my career as a systems administrator, and that inevitably ended up in sort of this field of interesting things called DevOps. And I was very interested. In fact, I came to Pittsburgh for a DevOps conference, which is where I first saw one of Jabe's business partners, Andrew Clay Schaefer, speak. And he was saying a lot of interesting things, provocative things, things that made me...
Wait, Andrew? No.
And, he's got this way with words and with speaking that is just very simple. And usually it's like a slide with like 4 or 5 words on it at a time. And he just makes you think about some stuff. And one of the things that he was really interested in was like the dimensions of a learning organization, which comes from, I believe it's Karen Watkins and Victoria Marsick.
Yep.
And Watkins and Marsick for short. And they wrote some interesting papers studying the characteristics, the qualities of learning, and in particular, what makes an organization a learning organization. And I imagine the 3 of you might have some opinions about the various like buzzwords that we all hear, like, let's become a blank organization or blank mindset, or insert whatever buzzword here. I'm really skeptical and cautious about that kind of stuff. So when we're revisiting learning, I don't want to just dig up the same old material and rehash the same old points. I want to explore a little bit new about it. And so Jabe and I have done a lot of thinking together, and Jabe in his doctoral research has done an immense amount of thinking about what it means to change systems, people, organizations, ecosystems. When you think about how you do that work, Jabe emphasizes, or Dr. Jabe, sorry, using the authentic, emphasizes the present and the immense capacity for possibility in the present. So that led me to say, okay, we've got this interesting background. How do we explore the present of learning in organizations? And for me, there's a little bit of a circuitous route to this, but for me, it's behaviors. It's about what you do, and as a result, what happens. So a little bit of background on that. Does that answer the question?
Yes. It gives me a good sense, and it fits to I guess what resonated with me, and when I was mentioning that example before from Jabe. So it was talking about present thinking and gap thinking, and so I had recognized in our organization we were exhibiting a lot of gap thinking. There was lots of audits, lots of surveys, lots of things to identify, long lists of stuff to do, and it wasn't helping. And I was getting quite frustrated because I didn't know how to articulate what was actually going wrong. So yeah, all of that resonates with me. How about you, Noah?
Well, this is a topic that's been kind of near and dear to my heart for years. When I first kind of got exposed to the fact that I didn't actually know what I was doing, it came in the form of systems thinking and the goal, as combined with Drive by Dan Pink. And kind of in the back of Drive, there's a list of like 25 books to read. And one of them is The Fifth Discipline. So that was just about the second or the third book that I read when I was coming to the realization that I had no idea what I was talking about. And so the concept of a learning organization really resonated and has been connected to a lot of what I've been doing ever since. And so like there's this thread through my career that connects all of it. And so when that was a possibility for us to discuss, I kind of leapt at the chance because I love this area.
I found the field book at a thrift store recently.
Oh, wow.
I've never seen the field book, so I'm excited to dive into it too. That's great.
Oh yeah, I came across that on my online research in the prep for this show. So yeah, I'm going to start looking through the thrift stores. So we mentioned Peter Senge's work, and I believe that he was building on thinking from Deming and had done some collaboration with Schön and others who I wasn't that familiar with until I heard about Schön in a recent episode of Thought Reactors, I believe it was.
Yep.
So, which is, for anyone who's unaware, is Jabe and Ben's they say bi-weekly, I say fortnightly live stream show. So I've caught, I think, three episodes. It's just nice and convenient Friday morning. I have a bit of space there, and it comes on, and some really fascinating topics, including one on hauntology, I think, for Halloween, which that topic has haunted me. Yeah. So check that out. So we mentioned Senge's work. What was your first connection with that work, and is it still resonant, or have views on learning organizations shifted? What are some of the challenges with it?
So Senge's work I mean, I've talked about this a little bit with Ben in other places, but really quickly, there is kind of an epicenter around MIT and in Boston of a bunch of systems thinkers, right? So you've got people like Deming and you've got people like Akoff. So Akoff's down in Wharton and Deming is, floating around all over the place. They both eventually work in the Department of Agriculture at some point. So they're very interested in understanding systems from a statistical point of view. But that systems thinking in particular gets really ripened by an interaction between Akoff, or at least in my mind, between Akoff and some other writers from the UK who are interested in socio-technical systems theory. And so the result of that ends up being kind of this blossoming of systems thinking inside of what's called organizational research, right? So, or operational research. And so operational research becomes the thing that Akoff does. And that ends up being roughly what people like Senge and Schön and Schön and these other people are doing. They're interested in understanding how organizations operate through problem solving in particular, right? They're really interested in like, how do people solve problems inside organizations? And that becomes their kind of research structure. And they bring in a set of theory from computation, because this is like, there's a little bit of like CMU in here, a little bit of computational stuff thrown in, especially around MIT. And that set of theory is something that's referred to as general systems theory. And the general systems theory is basically this idea where a bunch of, in particular, biologists start going, hey, there's this weird thing that happens, which is like, we can't describe what a mouse does by describing what the mouse's atoms do. Yeah. So there's got to be this thing that the mouse is certainly made of atoms, but it is itself something that we can point at, and it has like behaviors and it does things. And let's call that a system. It's a mouse system. And if we can see this in biology, we should probably generalize the traits of this thing that we are calling a system. And that becomes what's called general systems theory. And then all of that kind of births things like I said, operations research, computation. Almost everything that happens at CMU is all birthed from this kind of moment in time where systems theory comes online. And so like really quickly from there, you get things like Senge trying to reintegrate like human systems, because he's pulling from Trist and the Tavistock Institute and pulling in socio-technical systems theory to say, hey, let's not forget that these particular kind of systems are made out of humans, and humans have special traits, blah, blah, blah. And just to really quickly answer the secondary question, which was like, where's it going? At MIT, modern contemporary systems theory is called Theory U, and it has to do with individual and group transitions. So the U has to do with the dip in performance. You'll see this in like a bunch of like performance curves where people talk about J curves as the way that things change. The things initially has to go down. And at MIT, they just call it Theory U. It's just a set of theories about how transitions happen. Anyway, the point that I wanted to really get to through that long ramble, though, a little history of trying to kind of figure out the literature there, is this one thing which I think is not heard well or is not grasped onto well by most people. In a learning organization, we're not talking about an aggregate of people who are learning. And what I mean by an aggregate is that it's not a pile of people who happen to be in the same place learning. a learning organization is a system that it itself is learning. The organization is learning. It may be true that there are people in that organization that are learning, but the organization itself is learning. And part of what, when Ben and I talk about things like behaviors and observing behavioral change is, can you see the behavior or the organization change if you see that the behavior of the organization, not individuals, the organization changes, the organization has learned. Yeah. And sometimes I try to say it this way, right? Like if we were, this is a question of the unit of analysis is what we would say. And so like if you went and talked to somebody about in a neuroscience program about learning, they would immediately start talking to you about neurons and the way that neurons interact and blah, blah, blah. And if you ask them, okay, so like, that's great, but what is, like, how do we know something has changed? Like, how do we know that learning has occurred? They basically say, well, the relationships between the neurons would change and encode a different set of information. Yeah. So one of the ways to think about organizational learning is that it's changing the dynamics of the processes, practices, behaviors, and structures of the organization to re-encode new behavioral outputs. And it's the change in the structure that enables those new behaviors to occur. And so that's really part of like when people think about things, like you have to think about, okay, so if I want a learning organization, I'm probably not starting by walking around with the mindset stick and beating people over the head and saying, you just have to have a learning mindset. The problem is you're not learning.
Grow.
That's not the point at all of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about a learning organization.
100%.
I got a question that kind of comes out of that, because one of the things that I come across from time to time on LinkedIn is the argument that organizations aren't sentient, right? And so they don't have a collective, they don't have a memory, they don't have a personality, they don't have a behavior. And so as you're talking about a learning organization and not an aggregate of individuals learning within the organization, how do you marry those two things up?
So I mean, I disagree, I guess, entirely. I would say that organizations, well, so, I mean, sentience is a weird thing, right? So like, let's put that little tiny piece to the side. Organizations have agency. They can change the behavior of individuals radically, right? And one of the things, there's two points I usually try to make about this. One is that most organizations at any reasonable scale are designed to outlive every human in them. They have more agency than any individual in them. In fact, very frequently, all the individuals will be completely replaced and the organization will still be there. So lots of agency, lots of structure that reproduces behaviors that don't have anything to do with the individuals in it, because the individuals can be completely replaced. Yeah. Two, I try to keep convince people of this all the time, because one of the things that I think comes out of like systems thinking and learning organizations to some extent is to understand the limit of executive power in most organizations. So like I was a CTO. Pretty quickly when you're a CTO, you go, oh, I can't just tell people what to do. Like I just can't, like, what am I going to do? If they don't do it, I'm just going to fire them all? Like if they don't do what I say, what happens? And the answer is like, that's not how change occurs in organizations. Executives can shape the kind of channels and pathways that things evolve along, but they can't just say like, we're going to do this and everybody, kowtows and does that. That doesn't happen in most organizations. And so in both cases, there's a lot of agency of the organization itself. In other words, it might not be thinking the way that like people think about humans thinking, making decisions, but it's definitely shaping behaviors, A. And B, it's, if we believe kind of the thing that I previously said, it's structuring the way that people relate, what they can talk about, what they can look at, what's important, blah, blah, blah. And that significantly shapes the decisions that are actually made by the individuals in it. So, it's like, again, It's like saying the brain doesn't exist because we can point at neurons, right? Like you have to be careful to separate the difference between saying like a brain and a soul. Like I think that the comment you get on like it's not sentient is close to saying, well, there's no soul, like humans don't have souls. Sure, but you have a brain, right? You have some metastructure, some system of interacting neurons that's producing results. Anyway, that's roughly what I say. I would say I don't agree that organizations don't think. I think they do.
In some ways, it sounds a little bit like a ship of Theseus argument.
100%. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. And most organizations are very much like that. And I think you have to be really careful to not say, I mean, the ship of Theseus isn't just like, you can't just explode it and replace all the planks at once. Like it's an evolutionary constant replacement theory, right? Like it's a transitionary theory. It is not again, the trick I'm trying to like avoid getting to is we don't want to reduce the systems once again to aggregates. So it's not just that there's a bunch of people who all happen to be in the same building. It is.
You mean there's not a checklist of 1,000 items I can follow to become a learning organization?
No. Yeah. And I mean, it's,
what am I doing?
Sometimes
here?
I say like, sometimes I do one more quick feint here, right? Sometimes I say to people like, hey, you keep on saying you want to have a platform engineering team because you need a platform. And I'll say to them, you have a platform. If you're deploying software, you have a platform. You might have a default platform. You might not have noticed that you have a platform. Your platform might be people. I call them soylent platforms, right? Like that are like pushing papers around, but you have a platform. Same thing with learning organizations. You have a learning organization. Any organization is a learning organization. Are you actually like actively trying in the same way that you would try to shape a platform? Are you trying to shape the learning of the organization? That's the secondary question. But every organization learns. Every organization encodes behaviors that it repeats through the types of relations that we talk about. Sorry.
So that probably connects to one of my favorite quotes from the fifth discipline, which is the only sustainable competitive advantage is learning faster than your competition. So if every organization is a learning organization, then it's not a binary. The question is, are you learning effectively? Are you learning quickly? Are you even learning quickly enough to survive and grow in a world that's changing?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's not just competition, not just other companies. It's the environment itself, for sure.
I felt this most strongly in my CTO role at Seek Asia, because it was happening at a time when we had global competitors entering into the Southeast Asian markets. And so you realize that your time was limited, and their capacity and their war chests were massive. So you had to eke for any advantage, and that couldn't be just what advantage you can achieve over the next week. You had to think in terms of what you're building on as well. Yep. Now we have a question from the audience that I might just put on screen. And Ben, I saw you had some interactions. I might let you lead off with this question and your response.
Oh, I like that question.
It's a really good question, yeah, because I think it points at a lot of the ways that organizations talk about introducing trends or capabilities to the organization. Like, we're going to become a customer-focused organization, like as if there's an end state where you've become customer-focused enough, or we're going to become. Jabe likes to talk about what is it, the truisms. It's like, just pick a good thing that you would never want the opposite of, and just like put that, slap that on your strategy or slap that on the wall or what have you. And then, eventually you will become the company that is, completed that journey. Right. And so Jay is like really pointing at an interesting thing here is like, can there be a learned organization, like an organization that has arrived at learned? It was a learning organization for a time, and then it accomplished its learnedness. So, and I think it's a really interesting question because if an organization were to have accomplished that state, I wonder how long until it's dead. I wonder how long until it ceases to exist. But then I was realizing that, well, if it's in a static environment or an extremely slow changing environment, or it has enough, of a war chest or, fat reserves to live off of for a time, I mean, maybe it'll outlast us and then figure itself out later. Maybe the environment will change. I'm trying to find all the other ways that this could work out for our doomed organization. But to me, the organization is a dead one walking. Yeah.
I got a theory where some of these organizations can survive without being intentional about it, because by the way they have feedback loops in the right places. And so sometimes I hear people say, like, we have to be intentional about these things, and I'm like, that can help, but then people look at it and go, like, hang on, this organization's not being intentional about anything they do and they're still surviving. How can that be? And my theory is that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think that, like, lots of organizations can get into rich veins, basically. You can see this inside organizations too, right? Like, you don't have to, like, because the organizations can have little sub-organizations in them, right? And sometimes I call them cancer inside organizations. And what you'll see is that parts of organizations fail to respond to the external pressures, the market pressures, because they're so well insulated inside by feedback loops that are positively creating their opportunities inside the organization, that they grow in ways that are no longer responsive to market pressures, right? And you can see a lot of that happen inside organizations. So organizations that get big war chests or get really wealthy, they can sustain themselves for quite a long time on kind of like ongoing behaviors that go against market pressures, for sure. And that I think has something to do with the question of, like, when we talk about a learning organization, we talk about whether a learning organization can be like a strong network or not. So, like, we might say, like, learned just means that the network of relationships that I was describing as learning become encoded in a way that they don't change anymore. That's learned. We're done learning. We've encoded, right? On the other hand, if we're in dynamic environments, then we end up in a position where the question ends up being, can we change the relationships in a way that produces the beneficial outputs or sustainable behaviors, right? And that just means, like, can we rearrange the way that the network is working internally in order to relate better to the external thing? And there's actually, in complexity, there's an interesting version of this. And the argument goes like this: to have an identity, so to have a system, to be able to point at something and say, that's a company, it necessarily must move slower than the context that it's in. Because if it moves at the same pace, if an organization responds to every stimuli from the environment that it's in, so it's moving at the speed of the environment, it becomes invisible. It just is now part of the environment. So, like, you actually, in order to have an identity, in order to have something that you can point at and say, this is a thing, this is a fish, the fish has to move slower than the environment that it's in. It has, and therefore it has to have things like buffers and things like this. So the really interesting things when you kind of think through this from a theory of constraint perspective is, even in the theory of constraints, there's a moment where even in theory of constraints, we end up talking about buffer management. We talk about, like, isolating ourselves appropriately from markets, not just being completely responsive. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I really wanted to quickly say about this, just because I was thinking about when we were talking, I think one of the ways to answer the learned question is also to point towards organizations that have been successful in having something stable, but continuing to learn. And one of the prime examples of this is Toyota. And one of the things that has stayed successful is the Toyota way is static. And the Toyota way says, like, single piece flow. It's got a couple different principles in it. But the organization itself has remained dynamic and learning. Maybe we could question some of their like in the early 2000s, they had some screw ups. But anyway, the point being that if you look at the principles that they chose, one of the reasons why they have a static set of principles is because they chose asymptotic goals. You can never reach single piece flow. It can only be an aspirational thing. So in a way, those goals end up being things that are not there to be achieved, but to be inspirational and to be continuously reproduced. So this means that like the principles, because we know we can never get to the learned state, to the completely encoded stable state. All we can do is say, okay, that means we constantly have to recode the organization. We gotta learn all the time in order to just keep up with trying to get towards single piece flow, because it's asymptotic, and it is a direct relationship between the internal and external part of the organization. So it's like single piece flow in particular is a market problem. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I achieved single piece flow when I was buttering my toast this morning.
Now
I feel like we've connected to where this may resonate strongly with CTOs. We were describing structures within organizations that become buffered or immune to market forces, and that feels like it's described a fair number of IT and software departments I've come across both in my career and also as a coach. So let's dig into the relevance of this topic of the behaviors of a learning organization and its relevance for CTOs. Who would like to start?
Well, can I frame a question a little bit there? So we're trying to identify the characteristics of a learning organization. So you've got yourself isolated, your CTO or your CIO has recognized that they're isolated. How do they recognize it, and what would they be looking to identify, or what would they be looking to do in order to start shifting that?
There's something like a thread that I almost want to pull through everything we were just discussing. And one of the things Jabe mentioned was the unit of analysis question. Are you looking at the neurons, or are you looking at clusters of things, or are you looking at the whole body? And organizations have that kind of unit of analysis piece to them. And I think it's really interesting to, look, I think L&D as a thing was like really individual focused, like who's taking what courses, et cetera. And then at the other extreme end, you have these like massive kind of like compulsory adopt your growth mindset or what have you. And I think there's a theme in Watkins and Marsick's work, which is rejecting the compulsory aspect of this, but actually focusing on enrollment in ideas and so on. But where I really want to take this is actually back to the ship of Theseus, because if we're talking about how each individual part might be replaced over time, I think is a really interesting question to ask. What is the shape of the ship? I'm going to abuse this like idea a little bit, but like, what is the shape of the ship at one point in time? And what is the shape of the ship at another point in time? What is the design? Is it Legos where you're literally just snapping things back into the same spot with a different brick of the same exact shape and size? Or is it changing? And I think to connect back to Jabe's sort of observations around that, how does the change get shaped? How do you do that? And so very abstract, okay, fine. Behaviors. We can actually go back to the Senge things for inspiration. We can go back to Watkins and Marsick for inspiration. And we can look at things like talking about the unit of analysis. Let's talk about teams. Teams are organizations, right? So you've got cells and clusters right inside these bigger bodies, companies, whatever. But teams or organizations, could we take that unit of analysis instead of maybe at the individual? Let's bump it back up a little bit. And one of the things Senge points at is interest at the team level in how the team is learning together, as opposed to how the process of doing work is getting more and more certain or determined, basically. So I think it would be really interesting, for example, with a CTO who might have a couple people in their, let's say, their cabinet or what have you, right? What is the CTO's team? They're obviously the CTO has peers, but the CTO probably also has people that they surround themselves with, right? That are maybe a little bit more junior, maybe doing some of the running around and connecting the dots and finding information and so on, right? What does that team, what does their learning look like? Do they consider themselves a team? Do they make bets together? Do they negotiate shared visions together? That's another aspect of this that comes up both in Watkins and Marsick and also in Senge. So I think this is the beginning, and I'm kind of curious where you all might take this. But for me, that's the place to start. Is like, let's shift the unit of analysis to team level, just a little bit higher than we're used to, maybe, and then start to explore, well, what does that organization, as a putting aside sentient being, do, right? What does it do? How is it doing right now?
Yeah. I think there's some other things that are interesting. Like one of the things that I encourage, that I've worked with CTOs to do in the past, is to help their organizational members understand organizational design. And so like one of the things to recognize about being a CTO is like kind of organizational design tends to like, one of the first things you might point out is like there's different ways to organize an organization. So you might organize around function, you might organize around customer, you might organize around region, right? There's some basic structures that'll lead you to do this. And of course you get matrix structures, and then you get like I blended the veggies into your smoothie version of matrix structure, which is the Spotify structure, where we hide the matrix and pretend it's not there by giving it funny names. Anyway, but the point being, as a CTO, you're always in an interesting position because you're the head of a function. So you are automatically in a particular way looking at organizational design, right? Or at least your role is particularly that way. And so one of the things that I think is really critical, and CTOs inside their own organizations can usually recognize this pretty quickly, functional organizations, highly functionalized organizational structures are really brittle. They're really brittle, right? So you organize your stuff into like all the database engineers, all the front end engineers, all the operations people, blah, blah, blah. And then you just get in fights with people because you have to like, what are you doing? Like a pool structure, or are you doing a permanent team structure? If you're doing a permanent team structure, you're not really a functional structure anymore. Like, anyway, point being.
And it's often justified based on learning, right? So like, oh, you're in a functional structure because the person that's more experienced than you, who knows that role, that's why that you're reporting into them. And
this is exactly my point. Like giving people the skills to understand how did your team get formed? How is the structure that you're within formed, so that you at least have some understanding what you're being expected to learn about. All these questions. And then there can be questions within the organization about what should we be learning about? And, like, so for instance, like you see these types of movements all over the world. You get like project to product movement, right? That's basically moving from a highly functionalized pool-based resource structure into a standing team structure that's defunctionalized, and people are brought together and they're focused on a particular customer line or market niche, right? So those are different questions that you can start asking about. What do I want my organization to learn? In general, when I find organizations that have like these highly siloized systems, I personally don't mind silos. I mind silos that don't have any porous boundaries, that can't share information, that can't share functions, that can't flow information and work across them, right? That's what I care about. And so those are the things you immediately look at. It's like, why are you building such a hard boundary between you and the other system? Well, I mean, do you have some sort of wacky, racy structure that makes individual teams highly responsible for some subcomponent of a system so that they have to optimize the subcomponent without thinking about the whole system? One of the best ways to do that and make sure that you can do things with the quality expected on time is to disentangle yourself as much as possible from anybody else's decision making in the organization. Because the minute you start inviting other teams in to help, like, get in your decision making and get in your quality control and blah blah blah, when you start integrating the silos, when you start having, information exchange and stuff like that, well, now it's really hard to pin down who's responsible for what just happened, the quality issue, or this issue, or like who do we call when the system goes down, stuff like that. So those are all from a design theory perspective. Instead of having a list of qualities you want the system to have, one of the things you might do is come up with a list of trade-offs that you're trying to make. Right? And what you're trying to do when you're trying to get the organization to learn is you're going to say, these are the trade-offs we're making. These are the types of things, like, you might have to do a little bit more of this. If you do a little bit more of this, it's going to come at the cost of that. So just want you to understand the trade-off, so that as you're moving forward, the trade-offs aren't like just made by default. They're actually thought through, and that we're not overly committed to being in a particular direction in the design. And then you get people who can go, okay, so, like, the trade-off between being product-centric versus being product-centric has to do with how well we satisfy the customer versus how well we satisfy budgetary constraints and timelines. That's a trade-off. Do you want to say to the people, don't care about budgets and timelines? No, you don't want to tell them that. You want to say, like, we need to have a certain amount of these qualities and a certain amount of these qualities, and their intention with each other. So as you move forward, you need to learn the right balance between those things. And those end up being, I think, more interesting discussions about how to integrate both different functions, but different properties and qualities you want the system to have. And, like, being careful and thoughtful about saying, these are the trade-offs, these are the qualities. And so, when Ben and I often talk about strategy, this ends up being partly what we mean by strategy, right? Partly what we mean by strategy is create a set of tools to make good decisions about things you cannot decide prior to their occurrence. So you're just giving people the tools to say, okay, so we're not sure what kind of events you're going to run into, what kind of market things are going to happen. We don't want to pre-shape all these decisions entirely. What we want to do is say, these are the type of decisions we think you might have to make. And here are a set of tools to help you make a better decision based on that, right? So I think that's, like, when you talk about, like, finding cancerous bubbles inside of organizations, what you're seeing in effect is people intentionally creating hard boundaries, isolating themselves so that they can locally optimize their performance and get rewarded for that local optimization without care for, another way to say trade-off, without care for the externalities into the larger organizational context. They don't care because they're not rewarded for that. And you need to work carefully to stitch the organization back together so that the learning isn't in little isolated pockets about little isolated things, and it becomes learning about how the whole organization comes together, how the whole it participates in the result.
And so to link back to what Ben was describing at the team level, so some decisions are sort of team level decisions about how they operate, but not every decision can be at the team level. So you were then, Jabe, you were talking about the relationships between teams.
That's right.
And I know with our experience at Seek Asia and other organizations have been at having some form of theory about how the teams interact, one that we're all contributing to and visualizing can be helpful. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think really quickly, like, I think one of the things you see that's really interesting and indicative of how immature this whole idea is in our industry is, if I go and ask you to give me the metrics for a team, you're going to give me things like velocity, the escape defects, blah, 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 right? But if I say to you, what are you measuring at the team of teams level? How do you know that you're improving at your team of teams level? What are you measuring? Most people have no answer for that. So like, are you measuring dependency? Are you measuring dependency discovery? As in like, I determined while trying to do something that I have a dependency on another team that I didn't know about. Are you measuring ticket flow across teams? As in like, I gave Ben a ticket to do and I can't finish my work until Ben gets his work done. Are you measuring patch flow? Do you know how, have you done any sort of, like, if you, most flow engineering people come and talk to you about ticket flow, but has anybody tried to figure out why it takes a long time to patch across teams? Like, what happened? Like, have you thought about that? Have you thought about the processes, infrastructure, the team structuring and organizational structuring that prevents people from patching across teams? And would it be advantageous to maybe think about that type of flow across your organization? So when we start talking about these interconnected larger structures, we don't even really have any way to measure them in most cases. And I think that is really critical for people to start thinking about, because measurement is part of decision making, right? And I don't even necessarily mean measurements to part of decision making as in the measurement will tell you what to do, but the measurement will point and say, there's like, this area over here is worse than that area over there, so maybe you should pay more attention over here right now, right? Like, that type of measurement is the type of measurement. And I talk about it sometimes. It's like good hunting grounds for going to the Gemba. And nowadays what you have is roughly like, again, like individual teams you might go to because the team itself isn't performing well. But if you move up from that, you get these very weird effects because people start aggregating their metrics together. So you're getting averages, which totally hides the actual interactions. You can't see what's happening anymore. It's like, you're trying to manage by Rorschach at that point. So anyway, I think those are interesting discussions for people to think about if they want to think about, like, what would it mean to work across silos without necessarily de-siloing, creating learning organization, examining and thinking about the learning organization as this modulation of relationships. So anyway.
Yeah.
So I want to come back just briefly to the trade-offs conversation and point out something that I think that I'm not sure a lot of people recognize, which is there has been in software an explicit trade-off conversation since about 2001. And most of us, I'm not sure, realize it. If you look at the Agile Manifesto, it is explicitly framed as we're going to do more of these things and less of these things. It's an attempt to reprioritize and make explicit a set of trade-offs that weren't being talked about openly before. And so I think in a lot of ways, for a CTO to sit down and think about the trade-offs they're making, that makes a reasonable starting framework. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the end answer that you come up with. But if you're looking for how would I actually frame the way that I, talk about trade-offs, the way that I prioritize them, that seems like a really good place to start.
I think it's a great place to start the discussion, especially if you're willing to start the discussion by saying, I think that too many people read the Agile Manifesto too dogmatically. These are trade-offs. They're not absolutes. Yeah. And people like absolutes, right? Like, it's like more like, if someone asks me a question, I would rather have them ask me a question that I can have a mathematical answer to than some that has like a philosophical answer. I like philosophical answers, but most people don't appreciate it because it's too fuzzy. It's like, how do we ever come to an agreement? We're just going to bicker with each other about it. So people like to turn things into absolutes and quantifiable absolutes. And I think that's part of the problem with the manifesto, not the manifesto's problem. The way the manifesto is used by people is they use it as a cudgel, and they sharpen the edges up instead of allowing for the trade-off to be discussed actively.
Yeah, like the trade-offs aren't like deployable. Like you can't just come in and be like, deploy, blueprint, run your chef commands or whatever, and now your organization has the Agile Manifesto trade-offs. I think part of the methodology stuff with the conversations there too is like the adapting moment. Like, first of all, do you understand why certain trade-offs were pointed at when they wrote the thing, regardless of whether it's the Agile Manifesto or like the latest whatever SAFe or Lean or Six Sigma or whatever it is, right? Why are they talking about that, right? Why are they privileging that in the discussion? And if you can sort of have a grasp of that together, perhaps at a team level, you can start to then have the question about like the adapting, right? Which I think is the, hey, look at the knobs and dials of like more customer like satisfaction, less, or I should say like more time to actually get there, right? More design work, more care in a particular stage. Like the more than less than conversation is, I think, an interesting, like, for the complexity nerds in the room, maybe an interesting way to start having those conversations. Like, more of this causes less of what, or more of what, and to even just like start to feel the words and touch the knobs and the dials and start to feel that they're there. And then like as a whole coming together and being like, okay, all right, we talk about like opinionatedness sometimes. Like when Jay was talking about like the organization has to be slower than the environment. I think it has a lot to do with the opinionatedness about the trade-offs and the way they believe things ought to be. It's like, well, a learning organization is coming back to the question of like, what do we want to be? What trade-offs do we want to make? What trade-offs are we actively making, right? So does that change over time too? So I don't know.
I like how you started with teams, Ben, when we started this conversation, because in order to have good interactions between teams, it sort of needs to start with at least one team that works and can make decisions, right? And so for CTOs, who, if they're feeling challenged currently, then it may not be to work out the perfect system of how all the teams interact and do another big diagram.
Right. Yeah.
It probably starts with cultivating the environment where at least one team can succeed, and then building from there.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yep.
There's something weird that, and perhaps rude, that I said to a CTO recently, which had a lot to do with they were feeling pretty powerless in the dynamic that they were engaged in. Different people expecting different things from them, and they were getting a lot of the blame for certain kinds of things that weren't going great. And the conversation ended up in a place where it was like, well, who's actually building things, right? Who's shaping the ship as it's being built, who's making the trade-offs, right? Sometimes you're having open conversations with other parts of the organization to decide those explicitly and agree together, or at least negotiate. Sometimes you're not. And I think it's really interesting, if anyone could get their act together, could it be you and your team? And the way that you are engaging, especially if you're the ones building things, gosh, it's really interesting if you're making very sensible decisions because you're learning together, having a vision together, regardless of what the other parts of the organization say, right? As a starting point. I'm not saying that you stay there, because that sounds more like locking down the silos, and then you think about airtight spaces as they can have nasty gases in them, right? So like, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, as a first kind of step, I think in agreement with what you all have said as well, is like, can we do it here? We can do it here. Okay, I'm seeing hope. I'm seeing different behaviors at the organizational level, at the team level, or what have you. So if you're seeing those changes, then there's hope. And if there's hope for one, then there's hope for all, right?
That's great. And our conversation has flown by. We're in our final 5 minutes. I feel Ben has done a fantastic job of recapping some of the concepts there, and at least in terms of the practical applications for CTOs. Maybe just to concretize it, I referred to an idea that Jabe had shared that had helped me during my time as a CTO. I'm just going to flick it up on screen. Now, I think this is a John Cutler remix. So I've also got the original tweet. I saved that in as many different ways as I could. It was very helpful for me. But it does really directly connect to what we were talking about. We shared a lot of different ideas today, and that the worst thing you could do would be to make that a shopping list of, all right, these are all the things that we've got to do to become a learning organization.
That's right.
Yeah, it's not about the gap. It's about where we currently are and what would be what's an improvement or an adjacent opportunity that we could reach for. And if you repeat that enough times and are grounded in what's actually working for the organization and have some feedback and some ways to detect your progress, then you will find these, or you may find other things that work for your organization.
100%.
Yeah,
I think like one of the key things to remember is you should never ask teams to solve problems they don't have or they can't see.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to learn is to close a feedback loop by saying, I can see this problem. I'm going to apply this tool to this problem, and I'm going to see that the problem goes away. That's learning. That's that you can close that feedback loop. And in too many organizations, what I see is people bring in external tools, external methods, external processes, giant frameworks, and they impose them upon teams holistically. Like, you have to do all of this stuff. And teams ends up being like, I don't know what half of this stuff was. I don't know what the problem. I don't see anything changing because I didn't have any of the I didn't have many of the problems, or at least I could not see many of the problems that these tools are intended to solve.
Yeah.
And like one of the prime examples of this, like to give a very technical version of this, but really quickly, Kubernetes has been inflicted upon so many organizations, and people are like, I don't understand that the developers hate it, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, did you have a bunch of containers that you needed to orchestrate? Did you have that problem? Because if you didn't have a bunch of containers that you needed to orchestrate and you tried to inflict Kubernetes on people, then they were like, I don't have this problem. So
no one's creating enough containers for our Kubernetes.
Well,
what's happening?
Right, and then
now I have a different problem.
That's correct. That's exactly
Our containers are clogging the Suez Canal or something. I don't know.
And then there's a I'll stop here, but there's a really interesting theory where one of the things you can try to notice is when the team becomes in service of the technology as opposed to the technology being in service of the team, and that inversion that Noah just pointed at. We need to make more containers to feed the Kubernetes. Now the teams are in service of the technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, hey, like maybe we'll need Kubernetes. Why do developers like containers? Well, developers like containers because they get isolated deployment units and they can know what's being deployed, blah, blah, blah. They value that. So let's convince them to make more containers. And then maybe eventually they'll start having problems that require orchestration. Now the technology is in service of the team. And so that's that feedback loop. That's part of the learning cycle. That's part of this like ideal present is what conditions have to be true to either cause the problem or solve the problem. And those are the questions that you're trying to ask. You're not trying to imagine that you're going to have problems 6 years from now that you should solve now. Solve the problem you have now. Notice the problems you have now, or give the teams the tools to reveal the problem in a way that it makes it tractable for them to solve. Those are the types of things you do if you're trying to do a learning organization in the ideal present.
Yeah, and every problem, every time that you apply technology to solve a problem, it introduces a new problem.
Absolutely,
because there are no consequence-free decisions.
Absolutely.
And so if you're not actually solving someone's pain, all you're doing is saddling them with more pain for a problem that they didn't recognize they had.
Yep.
All right.
All patches require patches require patches and patches and patches.
The other
All
thing
right,
I've
Jake.
heard you say, which is like, I hope you're good. I hope you like the problems you're creating now,
That's right.
or at least that they're worth it, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you know you're headed in the right direction.
All right, we got to wrap
Jay,
up.
where can we find you?
You can find me at Ergonomically. We work on helping people think about their work systems, the flow of work in their organization in relationship to socio-technical systems design. So how does the technology and their organizational design work together?
Excellent. And how about you, Ben?
Well, you can find me and my colleague David Hall, co-author as well, at strategyteaming.com, where we teach organizations and teams how to do the art of leadership, right, as teams. David and I also co-authored the strategy tactics pip deck in particular. Thank you for the product placement. I appreciate that. We co-authored this together, and so we love sharing and taking this toolkit on how to think strategically, which really I think has a lot to do with leadership as well, in organizations and in teams. So if you'd like to learn more about that, head over to strategyteaming.com.
Yeah, and you can catch them both on the Thought Reactors, which I believe the link was shared in the chat. And what about you, Noah?
So at the moment, if this has been an interesting conversation for you and left you with more questions than answers, I'm currently offering a free coaching call to the next 10 people that sign up. You can find me at the URL at the bottom. Make sure you put in the code. I love having these conversations. I love having the guests that we have on. So thank you both for coming. And I love continuing them with other people who are still curious after the fact. So I would love it if anyone took me up on this offer and we got to talk about it some more.
Cool.
And likewise, you can find my writing and also get in contact with me. I coach and consult, so greatcto.me. And I think that brings us to the end. So thank you very much, everyone who's listened today, and hope you got something out of it. And that has been another CTO Lifeline. Thank you.